Judge Camille Hudson, a highly respected federal judge in her late 40s, was known for her no-nonsense approach to justice and her deep commitment to reforming the system from within. Her reputation for fairness and her relentless pursuit of accountability had earned her both admiration and enemies in equal measure. On this particular day, Camille had decided to step out of her usual routine. Rather than remaining confined to her office or the courtroom, she chose to immerse herself directly in the environment she sought to impact, a rundown neighborhood notorious for its high crime rate and tense relationship with law enforcement. Camille had often said that true understanding of systemic issues required more than statistics and legal cases. It required seeing the lives behind the numbers. Dressed in understated, casual clothes, simple jeans, sneakers, and a loose jacket, Camille blended seamlessly into the backdrop of the struggling community. Her goal was to observe, listen, and understand without revealing her identity or position. She had deliberately left her badge and any indications of her profession behind, wanting to experience the neighborhood as any other resident might. This wasn't her first time visiting this area, but today felt different. She had heard unsettling reports of increasingly aggressive police behavior towards residents, particularly younger black men, and she wanted to see the dynamics firsthand. The neighborhood, with its graffiti-covered walls and cracked sidewalks, bore the scars of neglect. Broken streetlights flickered intermittently, casting an eerie glow over the scene. Despite its challenges, the area was alive with the resilience of its people. Children played in front of dilapidated apartment buildings, and elderly women sat on stoops, chatting and watching the world go by. Camille noticed every detail: the tension in some faces, the quiet determination in others. She nodded politely to passers-by as she walked, her eyes scanning the environment, taking mental notes. Meanwhile, Officer Jake Thompson, a rookie cop, barely 6 months into his assignment, patrolled the area from his squad car. Jake was in his mid-20s, with a youthful face that belied his growing sense of cynicism. Eager to prove himself, he had joined the force with idealistic intentions, but the reality of his work had hardened him faster than he anticipated. He had been assigned to this neighborhood as part of a push to increase police presence, a move that was meant to reassure residents but often had the opposite effect. Jake had already developed an instinct for spotting trouble. Though this instinct was often clouded by unconscious biases he hadn't yet acknowledged. As Jake drove down one of the neighborhood's main streets, his eyes landed on Camille. She was walking slowly, occasionally stopping to observe her surroundings. Something about her presence triggered his suspicion. She didn't look like she belonged, at least, not in Jake's mind. Her confident demeanor and her focused attention to the area struck him as unusual. Who was this woman? Why was she here? Jake's heart began to race, a mix of adrenaline and the thrill of potentially uncovering something. He pulled his car over to the curb and stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel-strewn pavement. Camille noticed him immediately. She had been trained to sense shifts in her surroundings, and the sight of the young officer approaching her with a determined stride told her all she needed to know. She didn't quicken her pace or change her expression. She simply stood still and waited for him to speak. Jake stopped a few feet away, his hand resting lightly on the holster of his weapon, a gesture that wasn't overtly threatening but was undeniably deliberate. He called out, his voice firm but not yet aggressive. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" Camille tilted her head slightly, studying him. She recognized the tone, the stance, the calculated way he sized her up. She had seen it countless times in her courtroom, often from officers who later had to defend their actions under cross-examination. This was not her first encounter with authority figures who assumed the worst based on appearances. "I'm just taking a walk," she replied evenly, her voice calm and measured. "Is there a problem?" Jake narrowed his eyes. Something about her tone, steady, unflinching, made him uneasy. It wasn't the response he had expected. Most people, when confronted by an officer, would either bristle with defensiveness or try to appease. This woman did neither. She stood her ground, her expression unreadable. "This area isn't exactly known for leisurely strolls," Jake said, his voice hardening slightly. "You live around here." Camille resisted the urge to sigh. She had encountered this line of questioning before, subtle, yet undeniably loaded. "Why do you ask?" she countered, her tone still calm, but now tinged with a quiet authority. Jake's jaw tightened. "It's just a routine question. There's been some incidents in this neighborhood lately. I'm just making sure everything's okay." "Incidents," Camille repeated, raising an eyebrow. "And you think I'm involved in one of them?" Jake flushed slightly, caught off guard by her directness. "I didn't say that. I just want to make sure everything's okay," Camille finished for him, her tone laced with a subtle irony that made Jake bristle. "Well, officer, I assure you, everything's fine." Jake hesitated. He could feel the control of the situation slipping through his fingers, and it unnerved him. He prided himself on being able to assert his authority, to maintain the upper hand, but this woman wasn't responding the way she was supposed to. She wasn't nervous, she wasn't defensive, she was composed, too composed. "Do you have ID on you?" he asked abruptly, hoping to regain control. Camille's eyes flicked to his hand, still resting on his holster. "I wasn't aware that walking required identification," she said. "But if you're so concerned, why don't you tell me exactly what you think I've done?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jake felt his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. This wasn't how these encounters usually went. Most people complied, even if reluctantly. This woman was turning the tables on him, and he didn't like it. "Look," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm just trying to do my job here. If you cooperate, this will go a lot smoother." Camille took a step closer, her gaze never wavering. "And what exactly does cooperation mean in this context? That I validate your unwarranted suspicion? That I submit to your authority without question? I've done nothing wrong, officer, and you know it." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. For a moment they stood there in tense silence, the sounds of the neighborhood fading into the background. Camille could see the conflict in his eyes, the battle between his training, his ego, and the faint but growing awareness that he might be in the wrong. "Let me give you a piece of advice," Camille said finally, her voice softer but no less firm. "Think carefully about your next move. It could have consequences you're not prepared for." Before Jake could process her words, a faint crackle came through his radio, breaking the tension. He hesitated, glancing between Camille and the car, torn between continuing this encounter and responding to the call. Camille watched him closely, noting the uncertainty in his expression. "You have a job to do, officer," she said, her tone almost conciliatory. "I suggest you focus on that." Jake hesitated for a beat longer before muttering, "Stay out of trouble," and walking back to his car. Camille stood motionless, watching him drive away, her mind already turning over the implications of the encounter. She knew this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. Officer Jake Thompson couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him after his brief interaction with the woman in the neighborhood. Something about her presence gnawed at him. She was too calm, too composed. It was as though she wasn't afraid of him or the authority he carried, a reaction he wasn't used to in his line of work, especially in this area. Jake wasn't a bad person, but he was young, inexperienced, and eager to prove himself. And like many rookies, he carried an unspoken need to assert his authority, to feel that he was in control. That woman's confidence had unnerved him, and the way she had turned his questions back on him had left him feeling exposed. As Jake patrolled the streets, his thoughts kept returning to her. He told himself that his instincts had been right, she didn't belong there. She wasn't part of the local community, not with the way she carried herself. What was she really doing there? Jake's mind raced with possibilities, each one feeding his growing suspicion. Was she scouting the area for something? Was she involved in something illegal but knew how to hide it well? His pride wouldn't let him simply move on. He needed to feel like he had resolved the situation, that he hadn't been outplayed by someone who might be trying to make a fool of him. Just as he was about to radio in for backup to do a follow-up sweep of the area, Jake spotted her again. She was farther down the block now, standing in front of a boarded-up community center. Her posture was relaxed, but there was an intensity in the way she studied the building, as though she were piecing something together in her mind. Jake slowed his car, watching her through the windshield. For a moment he debated whether to leave her be, but his gut told him otherwise. He pulled over and stepped out of the vehicle. The crunch of gravel under his boots caught her attention. Camille turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge his presence without giving away too much. Jake's stomach tightened as he approached her, this time with more determination. He wasn't going to let her sidestep his questions again. "You again," she said evenly, her tone a perfect balance of politeness and skepticism. "You seem to be spending a lot of time in this area," Jake said, his voice firmer than before. He was determined not to let her unsettle him again. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Camille sighed softly, as though she had expected this. She turned to face him fully, her hands relaxed at her sides. "I'm standing on a public sidewalk, officer," she said calmly. "Last I checked, that's not a crime." Jake felt a flicker of frustration. She was doing it again, answering without really answering, putting the onus back on him to justify his actions. He squared his shoulders, refusing to be thrown off balance. "I'm asking because this area has seen an uptick in suspicious activity lately," he said. "And you seem to be spending a lot of time observing things. Makes me wonder why." Camille tilted her head slightly, as though considering his words. "Suspicious activity," she repeated, her tone laced with quiet skepticism. "And you think a woman standing alone, looking at a boarded-up building, fits that description?" "I'm just doing my job," Jake shot back, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "Are you?" Camille asked, her tone sharpening ever so slightly. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks more like you're trying to create a problem where there isn't one." Jake took a step closer, his hand brushing against the radio clipped to his shoulder. The gesture wasn't lost on Camille, and her expression hardened slightly. "Look," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "you can either cooperate with me now, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." For the first time, Camille's composure faltered, but only slightly. She straightened her posture, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made Jake's breath catch. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, her voice low and deliberate. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." Jake's pride flared at her words. He was used to people backing down when he turned up the pressure, but she wasn't flinching. In fact, it seemed like she was daring him to escalate the situation. He couldn't let her have the upper hand, not again. Without another word, he reached for her arm, intending to lead her to his car. But the moment his hand touched her, Camille pulled back sharply. "Don't," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Jake froze for a split second, caught off guard by the sheer force of her tone. But then his frustration boiled over, and he grabbed her wrist more forcefully. "That's it," he snapped. "We're done here. Let's go." Camille didn't resist, but the look she gave him was enough to make his stomach churn. It wasn't fear or anger, it was something much worse, disappointment. You have no idea what you're doing, do you? She said softly as he pulled her toward his car. Keep walking, Jake muttered, refusing to let her words get to him. But they did. Each step they took toward his squad car felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the moment was finally catching up to him. He opened the back door and gestured for her to get in, but Camille hesitated, turning to face him one last time. You're going to regret this, she said, her voice calm but laced with a quiet intensity. Not because of me, but because of what it says about you. Jake clenched his jaw, refusing to respond. He closed the door behind her and radioed in the situation, his voice steadier than he felt. As he pulled away from the curb, Camille sat silently in the back seat, her expression unreadable. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a grave error, one that would come back to haunt him sooner than he expected. As the squad car pulled into the precinct parking lot, the atmosphere inside the vehicle was tense and heavy. Officer Jake Thompson kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. Behind him, Judge Camille Hudson sat calmly in the back seat, her face betraying no sign of the storm brewing inside her mind. Her silence was unnerving. Jake had expected her to argue, to protest, maybe even shout at him during the drive. Instead, she had said nothing, leaving him alone with his thoughts, his doubts, and his growing sense of unease. Jake told himself he had done the right thing, that his actions were justified. She had been evasive, uncooperative, and clearly hiding something at least. That's what he kept repeating to himself. Yet, the memory of her steady, unflinching gaze kept creeping into his mind. It wasn't the look of someone who had been caught doing something wrong. It was the look of someone who knew they were right, who was simply waiting for others to realize it. He parked the car and stepped out, opening the back door to let Camille out. She moved gracefully, despite the awkward angle of the handcuffs on her wrists. Jake avoided meeting her eyes as he guided her toward the station entrance, but he could feel her gaze on him, as if she were dissecting him with every step. Inside the station, the usual hum of activity filled the earphones ringing, officers typing reports, suspects being booked. Jake led Camille through the main area, drawing curious glances from his colleagues. A few officers raised their eyebrows at the sight of the well-dressed woman in handcuffs. One even leaned over to whisper something to his partner, but Jake ignored them. He couldn't afford to show any hesitation now. He brought her to a small interrogation room, its grey walls and fluorescent lighting creating a sterile, oppressive environment. He gestured for her to sit down, then hesitated for a moment before removing the handcuffs. Camille rubbed her wrists lightly but didn't say a word. She simply folded her hands on the table in front of her and looked up at him, waiting. Jake cleared his throat, trying to shake off the nagging doubt that had followed him since their first encounter. "All right," he said, his tone brisk. "Let's start with your name." Camille raised an eyebrow. "You don't know who I am?" she asked, her voice calm but tinged with incredulity. Jake frowned, her question throwing him off balance. "That's what I'm asking you," he said, his irritation slipping through. For a moment she simply looked at him, as though debating how much to reveal. Then, she leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed but commanding. "My name is Camille Hudson," she said finally, her words measured and deliberate. "I am a federal judge." Jake's heart skipped a beat, but he quickly masked his surprise with a scoff. "Right," he said, rolling his eyes. "A judge. And I'm the president." Camille didn't react to his sarcasm. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as though studying him. "You really don't believe me," she said softly, almost to herself. Jake crossed his arms over his chest. "Let me guess. You left your ID at home, right? Convenient." "I don't need to guess," Camille replied, her voice sharp now. "You've already made up your mind about me, haven't you? You saw a black woman in a neighborhood you decided she didn't belong in, and that was all the evidence you needed." Jake's jaw tightened. "That's not what this is about," he snapped. "You were acting suspicious. You refused to cooperate." "I refuse to let you harass me without cause," Camille countered, her tone icy. "There's a difference." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door to the interrogation room swung open. Sergeant Bill Carter, a grizzled veteran of the force, stepped inside, his expression a mix of curiosity and annoyance. "What's going on here, Thompson?" he asked, his eyes flicking between Jake and Camille. "I brought her in for questioning," Jake said quickly. "She was acting suspicious in the neighborhood, and—" "Wait a second," Carter interrupted, his eyes narrowing as he got a better look at Camille. His face paled slightly. "Is this Judge Hudson?" Jake froze. "You know her?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Carter let out a slow breath, running a hand over his face. "Yeah, I know her. Everyone in the district knows her. She's one of the most respected judges in the state." He turned to Camille, his expression apologetic. "Judge Hudson, I'm so sorry about this. I had no idea." "Apparently, neither did he," Camille said dryly, nodding toward Jake. Carter shot Jake a sharp look. "What the hell were you thinking?" he hissed. "You brought a federal judge in here. On what grounds?" Jake stammered, struggling to find the words. She wouldn't cooperate," he said weakly. "She refused to answer my questions." "She didn't have to," Carter snapped. "You'd better hope she's feeling generous enough not to file a complaint, or you're going to have a lot of explaining to do." Camille held up a hand, silencing them both. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Sergeant, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not here to cause a scene. However, I do intend to make it very clear that what happened today was unacceptable." Carter nodded quickly. "Of course, Judge Hudson, we'll make this right." Camille's gaze shifted back to Jake, who stood frozen, his face pale. "You still don't believe me, do you?" she asked him, her voice quieter now but no less sharp. Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. I didn't know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's the problem," Camille said, leaning forward slightly. "You didn't know, but you assumed. You assumed the worst about me without any evidence, without any justification, and you acted on that assumption because you could. That's what makes this so dangerous." Jake felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He wanted to defend himself, to argue that he'd just been doing his job, but deep down, he knew she was right. He had seen her in that neighborhood and decided she didn't belong, and everything that had followed had been shaped by that initial judgment. Carter cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Judge Hudson, if there's anything we can do to—" "There is," Camille interrupted, her eyes still locked on Jake. "I want him to understand the consequences of his actions, not just for me, but for every person he'll encounter in his career. Because if this is how he operates, it's only a matter of time before he ruins someone's life." Jake flinched at her words, but he didn't look away. For the first time, he felt the weight of what he had done, not just to her, but to himself, to the badge he wore, to the community he was supposed to serve. And for the first time, he wondered if he was truly cut out for the job. The air in the precinct was heavy with tension as Sergeant Carter escorted Judge Camille Hudson out of the interrogation room and into a quieter corner of the station. Officer Jake Thompson stood frozen, his mind racing as the events of the last hour replayed in his head. The weight of his mistake was beginning to settle on his shoulders, and the realization that he had detained a federal judge, a pillar of the very system he was sworn to uphold, left him feeling raw and exposed. Camille, however, was far from done with the situation. While she appreciated Carter's apology, she knew that this incident was a symptom of something far deeper, something systemic that needed to be addressed. She had spent years navigating the complexities of law enforcement and the judicial system, and this encounter was yet another example of why reform was so desperately needed. She wasn't angry, not in the way people might expect, but she was resolute. This moment wasn't just about her, it was about the countless others who didn't have her authority or platform to push back. Carter led Camille into his office, a cramped but tidy space cluttered with paperwork and coffee cups. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, her arms crossed as she stared him down. Carter, who had spent decades dealing with some of the toughest situations in law enforcement, felt uncharacteristically small under her gaze. "Judge Hudson," he began, his tone careful, almost pleading, "I want to personally apologize for what happened today. Officer Thompson made a mistake, there's no excuse for it, and I take full responsibility as his supervisor." Camille's expression didn't soften. "Sergeant Carter, your apology is noted, but I'm not interested in excuses or platitudes. I'm interested in solutions. This isn't just about Thompson. This is about a culture that allows officers like him to operate on instinct and bias instead of training and evidence." Carter nodded, swallowing hard. "You're right. You're absolutely right. I've been on the force long enough to know we have a lot of work to do." Camille tilted her head slightly, scrutinizing him. "Do you?" she asked pointedly. "Because I've heard these same words from officers and supervisors for years, and yet the problems persist. What's going to make this time different?" Carter exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Judge, I don't have a magic answer for you, but I can tell you that Thompson will face consequences for his actions. We'll make sure he learns from this." "Learning isn't enough," Camille shot back. "What about the next officer? And the one after that? How are you addressing the root cause? Because I can tell you right now, Sergeant, this precinct isn't unique. Incidents like this happen everywhere, every day, and most of the time, they don't end with someone who has the power to fight back." Carter was silent for a moment, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had spent his career walking the fine line between enforcing the law and navigating the politics of policing, and he knew she was right. But knowing wasn't the same as acting, and acting often came with consequences of its own: pushback from colleagues, resistance from the community, and a constant uphill battle against a system that seemed designed to resist change. Camille stepped closer, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its edge. "Sergeant, I'm giving you an opportunity here. This doesn't have to be another moment swept under the rug. You can use this as a turning point for your precinct, for your officers, and for the people you're supposed to protect. Or you can do what so many others have done: apologize, promise change, and let everything go back to the way it was." Carter met her gaze, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something: genuine determination, maybe, or a reluctant acceptance that he had to make a choice. Before he could respond, the door opened, and Jake stepped inside, his face pale and his movements hesitant. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. "Sergeant," he said quietly, avoiding Camille's eyes. "You wanted to see me." Carter gestured for him to sit, but Jake remained standing, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Carter sighed and turned to Camille. "With your permission, Judge, I'd like to handle this matter directly with Officer Thompson. If you'd prefer, we can do this privately." Camille shook her head. "No, I think it's important that he hears directly from me." Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had spent the last few minutes trying to prepare himself for whatever punishment was coming, but nothing could have prepared him for this. He finally forced himself to look at Camille, and the intensity of her gaze made him feel like a child caught in a lie. "Officer Thompson," she began, her voice calm but firm. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done today? Jake nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. I made a mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly and I. Stop, Camille interrupted, holding up a hand. This isn't about your excuses. This is about your actions. Do you understand why your actions were wrong? Jake hesitated, his mind scrambling for the right words. I assumed things about you that weren't true, he said finally. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. And what were those assumptions? Camille pressed, her tone unrelenting. Be honest, officer. If you want to learn from this, you need to confront it head-on. Jake felt his face flush with shame. I assumed you didn't belong in that neighborhood, he admitted quietly. I thought you might have been involved in something illegal. Camille nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. And why did you think that? What about me made you jump to that conclusion? Jake struggled to find an answer, but the truth was painfully obvious. I don't know, he said finally, though the words felt hollow even to him. It was just a feeling. A feeling, Camille repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. Do you know how many people have been harassed, detained, even killed because of someone's feeling? Do you understand the power you hold as an officer of the law and the responsibility that comes with it? Jake nodded again, but Camille wasn't finished. You didn't just make a mistake, Officer Thompson. You abused your authority. You acted on bias instead of facts, and you violated the trust that the community is supposed to have in you. And the worst part, you didn't even realize you were doing it. Jake felt the sting of her words like a slap to the face. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't meant any harm, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Intent didn't erase impact. Carter stepped in, his voice softer but no less firm. Thompson, this is a serious issue. We can't afford to have officers on the force who let their biases dictate their actions. If you want to stay here, if you want to earn back the trust you've lost, you're going to need to put in the work. That means training, counseling, and a hell of a lot of reflection, Camille added. And it doesn't stop there. You need to take responsibility not just for this incident, but for the way you approach your job moving forward. You need to be better, because if you're not, the next person you encounter might not have the means to hold you accountable the way I do. Jake felt a lump rise in his throat, but he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I understand. Camille studied him for a long moment, then turned to Carter. Sergeant, I'll leave it to you to determine the appropriate disciplinary action, but I'll be keeping an eye on this precinct. If I see any indication that this incident is being swept under the rug, I won't hesitate to take further action. Carter nodded, his expression grim. Understood, Judge Hudson. Without another word, Camille turned and walked out of the office, leaving Jake and Carter alone. Jake sank into the nearest chair, his head in his hands, as the full weight of what had just happened settled over him. For the first time, he truly understood the depth of his failure, not just as an officer, but as a person. And for the first time, he wondered if he could ever make it right. As the door to Sergeant Carter's office closed behind her, Judge Camille Hudson strode purposefully through the precinct's bustling corridors. The atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Officers who had previously whispered or glanced curiously in her direction now actively avoided her gaze, sensing the gravity of the situation. Camille, however, paid no attention to the awkward stares or nervous energy. She had spent her career moving through spaces like this, where her presence could command both respect and unease in equal measure. Today was no different. Her mind was already turning to what needed to happen next. She wasn't naive enough to believe that a stern lecture and some disciplinary action for Officer Thompson would resolve the deeper issues at play. This was about more than one rookie cop's mistake. It was about a culture that perpetuated those mistakes, a system that allowed them to fester. and she wasn't going to let this opportunity pass without making that crystal clear. Back in Carter's office, Jake Thompson sat slumped in his chair, his face pale and his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The silence between him and Carter was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the precinct's activity outside the door. Carter watched the young officer closely, his expression a mixture of disappointment and frustration. "You realize how close you just came to ruining your career, don't you?" Carter finally said, his voice low but firm. Jake didn't look up. "Yes, sir," he muttered, though the words felt inadequate even to him. Carter leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "This isn't just about you, Thompson. It's about this entire department. What you did out there today reflects on all of us. And let me tell you, the last thing we need right now is another incident that puts us under a microscope." Jake flinched at the word incident. He knew what Carter meant. Another story splashed across headlines, another reason for the public to lose faith in law enforcement. And now he was the one responsible for bringing that scrutiny to their doorstep. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Jake said quietly, finally lifting his head to meet Carter's gaze. "I thought I was doing my job." "No," Carter said sharply, cutting him off. "What you were doing was letting your biases dictate your actions. You saw her, you made assumptions, and you acted on them without a shred of evidence. That's not doing your job, that's failing at it." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but Carter held up a hand to stop him. "You're lucky she's handling this the way she is. Do you understand who she is, Thompson? That woman has more influence and authority than you can begin to comprehend. If she wanted to, she could have you out of this uniform and into a courtroom faster than you can blink." Jake swallowed hard, the full weight of Carter's words sinking in. "I know I screwed up," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix it." Carter sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. "That's the thing, kid. Some mistakes can't be fixed, they can only be learned from. The question is, are you willing to do the work? Because if you're not, you've got no business being here." Jake nodded slowly, his mind racing with a mixture of guilt and determination. He didn't want to give up on the career he had worked so hard to build, but he also knew he couldn't continue down the same path he had been on. Something had to change, starting with him. Meanwhile, Camille had made her way to the precinct's front desk, where she requested a meeting with the precinct captain. The desk officer, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, seemed momentarily taken aback by the request, but quickly nodded and picked up the phone to make the call. Within minutes, Captain Evelyn Monroe, a tall, no-nonsense woman in her early 50s, appeared in the lobby. Her sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on Camille. "Judge Hudson," Monroe said, extending a hand. "I was informed of the situation. Please come with me." Camille shook her hand firmly and followed her down a corridor to a larger, more private office. Monroe closed the door behind them and gestured for Camille to sit, but like before, Camille remained standing. Her posture was commanding, her presence undeniable. "I'm sure you're aware of what brought me here," Camille began, her voice steady but firm. "And I'll be blunt, Captain, what happened today is unacceptable. But more than that, it's indicative of a larger problem within this department." Monroe nodded slowly, her expression serious. "I understand your frustration, Judge, and I want to assure you that this incident will be addressed appropriately. Officer Thompson." "This isn't just about Thompson," Camille interrupted, her tone sharp. "Yes, his actions today were a problem, but he's a symptom, not the disease. The issue is a lack of accountability, training and awareness across the board. If you think disciplining one rookie officer is going to solve that, then you're as much a part of the problem as he is." Monroe bristled slightly at the accusation but didn't interrupt. She had heard enough about Camille Hudson to know that the judge didn't pull punches and she wasn't here to make friends. "What do you suggest, then?" Monroe asked, her voice measured. "I suggest you take a hard look at your department and the way your officers are trained and supervised," Camille said. "Bias training isn't enough if it's treated like a box to check off on a list. Your officers need to understand the communities they serve, not just patrol them like they're enemy territory. They need to be held accountable when they fail to do that, and that accountability needs to come from the top down." Monroe nodded again, her expression thoughtful. "I agree with you, Judge, but change doesn't happen overnight. These issues run deep, not just in this department but in law enforcement as a whole." "That's no excuse for inaction," Camille countered. "You have the authority to make changes here in your precinct. Start there. Set an example for others to follow." Monroe was silent for a moment, her eyes fixed on Camille. Finally, she said, "I'll see to it that this incident is thoroughly reviewed and that Officer Thompson receives the training and oversight he clearly needs. Beyond that, I'll speak with my senior staff about implementing more comprehensive reforms." Camille's expression remained impassive, but there was a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. "Good," she said. "I'll be following up to ensure that happens." Monroe raised an eyebrow. "You're not one to let things go, are you?" "No," Camille said simply. "I'm not." With that, she turned and left the office, her heels clicking against the tile floor with purposeful precision. As she stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, she felt a surge of determination. This wasn't the end of the fight, far from it. But it was a start. Back inside, Captain Monroe picked up the phone and dialed Carter's extension. "Bring Thompson to my office," she said curtly. "It's time we had a talk." Jake arrived minutes later, his face pale and his posture stiff. Monroe gestured for him to sit, and this time he obeyed without hesitation. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You've got a lot to learn, Thompson," she said finally. "And if you're not willing to put in the effort to do better, then you don't belong here. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Ma," Jake said quietly. "Good," Monroe said. "Because this isn't just about keeping your job. It's about earning the trust of the people you're supposed to protect. And right now you've got a hell of a lot of work to do." Jake nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. As he left her office, he couldn't shake the feeling that his entire career was hanging by a thread. But for the first time, he also felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to make things right, if he had the courage to take it. The tension in the precinct had not dissipated by the time Judge Camille Hudson walked back into the main corridor. Her mind was sharp and focused, every step deliberate as she approached the front desk where Sergeant Carter was waiting, his expression tense. Officer Jake Thompson stood a few paces behind him, his face pale and drawn, like a man awaiting sentencing. The weight of what had happened was now fully apparent to everyone involved, and the entire precinct seemed to vibrate with an unspoken sense of unease. Camille's presence commanded the room. She didn't need to raise her voice or demand attention, it followed her naturally, as if the very air shifted in her wake. Her posture was upright, her gaze unwavering. Even those who didn't know her immediately sensed that she was someone not to be trifled with. As she stopped in front of Carter, Jake instinctively took a small step back, avoiding her gaze. Camille, however, kept her eyes trained on him, studying him with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a critical operation. Judge Hudson Carter began, his voice formal but laced with apprehension. "I just spoke with Captain Monroe. She's reviewing the situation and working on a plan for further action. I can assure you." Camille raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "I'm not here for assurances, Sergeant. I've heard enough apologies and promises for one day. What I'm here for now is accountability, real accountability, not empty gestures or superficial reforms. Her words hung in the air, heavy and uncompromising. Carter nodded solemnly but said nothing, sensing that whatever she was about to say would determine how the rest of this incident unfolded. Camille's gaze shifted back to Jake, who seemed to shrink under her scrutiny. For a moment she said nothing, letting the silence stretch out between them like a taut wire. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but carried an edge that cut through the room like a blade. "Officer Thompson," she began, "you've spent the better part of this day trying to justify your actions to yourself, haven't you? Telling yourself that you were just doing your job, that your intentions were good, that it was all just a misunderstanding." Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly, though the words sounded hollow even to him. Camille stepped closer, her gaze never wavering. "But here's the truth, you need to face your intentions don't matter. What matters are your actions and the consequences of those actions. And today your actions reflected a deep, dangerous flaw in how you approach your role as a police officer." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but Camille didn't give him the chance. "You saw me, a black woman, walking in a neighborhood you decided I didn't belong in, and you let your assumptions dictate your behavior. You didn't ask questions, you didn't gather evidence, you didn't even stop to consider the possibility that your instincts might be wrong. Instead, you acted with arrogance and entitlement, assuming that your badge gave you the right to treat me as though I were guilty until proven innocent." Her voice, though controlled, had risen slightly in volume, drawing the attention of nearby officers. Jake's cheeks flushed with shame, but he forced himself to meet her gaze, knowing that looking away would only make things worse. Camille's expression was unreadable, but the intensity of her words left no room for doubt about the seriousness of her message. "Do you understand the damage you've done?" she continued. "Not just to me, but to yourself, to this precinct, to the very institution you claim to serve. Do you understand how moments like this erode the trust between law enforcement and the communities they're supposed to protect?" Jake nodded slowly, his voice trembling as he replied, I do now. I didn't see it before, but I do now." Camille's eyes narrowed slightly, as though weighing the sincerity of his words. After a moment she nodded, though her expression remained stern. "Good, because understanding is the first step. But it's not enough. If you truly want to make amends not just to me, but to every person you'll encounter in your career, you need to fundamentally change how you approach this job. You need to confront your biases, your assumptions, and your own limitations. And you need to do the work to earn back the trust you've damaged." Jake nodded again, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I will," he said, his voice steadying slightly. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Camille studied him for another long moment before finally stepping back. "We'll see," she said simply, her tone carrying both a challenge and a warning. She turned to Carter, who had been standing silently throughout the exchange. "Sergeant, I trust you'll ensure that the appropriate steps are taken to address this, not just for Officer Thompson, but for your entire department. This isn't just about punishing one individual. It's about creating a culture where incidents like this don't happen in the first place." Carter nodded, his expression grim. "Understood, Judge Hudson. I'll personally oversee the process." Camille's gaze softened slightly, though her demeanor remained resolute. "Good. I'll be following up to ensure that happens." With that, she turned on her heel and began walking toward the precinct's exit. The room seemed to exhale as she left, the tension finally breaking but leaving behind a palpable sense of gravity. Jake remained rooted to the spot, his mind a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, shame, determination. He knew he had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that he could find a way to do better. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the city streets. Camille paused for a moment on the precinct steps, taking a deep breath and letting the cool air fill her lungs. She knew this wasn't the end of the fight, far from it. But it was a step forward, a small victory in a much larger battle. As she walked to her car, she thought about all the people who didn't have the privilege of her position, who couldn't demand accountability or force conversations about change. It was for them that she fought, and it was for them that she would continue to push for a system that valued justice over power, fairness over prejudice. Because in the end, that was what it meant to truly serve the people. Weeks had passed since the tense encounter at the precinct, but the ripple effects of that day were still unfolding. For Judge Camille Hudson, the incident was a stark reminder of why her work extended beyond the courtroom. Her experience wasn't unique, it was emblematic of the broader, systemic issues that plagued law enforcement and the justice system. She had no intention of letting it fade into a distant memory. This was a moment to create lasting change, and Camille was determined to see it through. Her first step had been to follow up with Captain Monroe, who had agreed to implement a comprehensive reform program for the precinct. Camille had insisted on being directly involved, offering to bring in outside experts to conduct workshops and training sessions for the officers. Monroe, to her credit, had accepted the offer, though Camille suspected it was as much out of necessity as genuine commitment. The precinct had faced significant backlash from community leaders once word of the incident began to circulate, and Monroe knew she couldn't afford to appear indifferent. The training sessions began within weeks, focusing on bias recognition, de-escalation tactics, and community engagement. Camille attended the first session herself, sitting quietly at the back of the room as the officers listened to a guest speaker, a black former police chief, who shared his own experiences navigating prejudice within the force. Camille watched their faces closely, noting the range of reactions: discomfort, defensiveness, curiosity, and, in a few cases, genuine introspection. Officer Jake Thompson was among them, sitting in the front row with a notepad in hand. Camille had made it clear that his participation in these sessions wasn't optional. If he wanted to remain on the force, he would need to demonstrate not only his willingness to learn, but also his ability to apply what he learned in the field. Jake's journey since that day had been far from easy. He had faced scrutiny from his colleagues, some of whom quietly resented the attention the precinct was receiving because of his actions. Others had offered him support, urging him to take this as an opportunity to grow. But the hardest part had been confronting himself, his biases, his assumptions, his mistakes. It wasn't something he could fix overnight, and there were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But he kept showing up, kept doing the work, because deep down, he knew Camille was right. If he didn't change, he didn't belong in the job. Camille had made a point of staying in touch with Carter and Monroe to monitor Jake's progress. She didn't want to micromanage the process, but she also wasn't willing to let it slip through the cracks. During one of her check-ins, Carter had admitted that Jake was taking the training seriously, even going so far as to volunteer for community outreach initiatives. It was a small but encouraging sign. One such initiative brought Jake face to face with the neighborhood where the incident had occurred. As part of the precinct's effort to rebuild trust, a team of officers was tasked with organizing a community event: free legal aid, resources for housing and employment, and open forums where residents could voice their concerns about policing. Jake had been assigned to help coordinate the event, a task that initially made his stomach churn with anxiety. He wasn't sure how the residents would react to seeing him there, especially those who had witnessed his confrontation with Camille. On the day of the event, Jake arrived early, setting up tables and chairs under the watchful eyes of curious onlookers. He felt their stares, heard their murmurs, and forced himself to keep moving. When the event officially began, he stationed himself at a booth where residents could ask questions about police procedures and file complaints. It was a humbling experience hearing their stories, their frustrations, their pain, but it was also eye-opening. For the first time, he began to understand what Camille had meant when she talked about the damage his actions had caused. Midway through the event, Jake noticed a familiar figure approaching the booth. Camille Hudson, dressed in a crisp blazer and slacks, moved through the crowd with her usual air of quiet authority. She hadn't announced her intention to attend, but Jake wasn't surprised to see her. This event was as much a result of her advocacy as it was the precinct's initiative. "Judge Hudson," Jake said, standing a little straighter as she approached. "Officer Thompson," she replied, her tone neutral but not unkind. "How's the event going?" "It's been a learning experience," Jake admitted, his voice tinged with both humility and gratitude. "I've had some difficult conversations, but I think it's important." Camille nodded, her sharp eyes studying him. "It is, and it doesn't end here. This is just the beginning." Jake nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I know. I've still got a lot of work to do." Camille allowed a small smile to tug at the corner of her lips. "Good. Keep at it. And remember, it's not about proving yourself to me or anyone else. It's about being the kind of officer this community can trust." Jake felt a lump rise in his throat, but he nodded again, his resolve firm. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not giving up on me." Camille's smile widened slightly. "I didn't do this for you, officer. I did it for the people who deserve better. But I hope you make the most of the opportunity you've been given." With that, she turned and walked away, her presence leaving as strong an impression as her words. Jake watched her go, the gravity of her statement sinking in. He knew she was right, her efforts weren't about saving him. They were about holding him accountable and ensuring that he, and others like him, could become part of the solution rather than perpetuating the problem. As the event wound down and the sun dipped lower in the sky, Jake felt a cautious sense of hope. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a start. And for the first time, he believed he could earn the trust he had lost, one action at a time. Camille, meanwhile, left the event with a sense of guarded satisfaction. There was still so much work to be done, but today had shown her that change was possible, even if it came one small step at a time. As she drove away from the neighborhood, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The road to justice was long and often unforgiving, but it was a road worth traveling for herself, for the community, and for those who couldn't fight the battle alone.